From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melithopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Well, that was a very busy spring. As you know, for the past month, we've been very sporadic with releasing episodes. But with this episode today, we're going to be going back to our weekly release of shows. I've got some great shows lined up for June and July. And today we're going to be talking about something that's a lot of fun, especially if you're in Oregon. So I think many of you know there are bees that are specialists on squash. This was covered by Dr. Jim Kane a number of episodes ago. And these bees were never found in Oregon until recently. Today, we're going to be talking with Miranda Jones, who is in the Honors College here at Oregon State University. She's getting her major in biology and minoring in entomology. She's going to be launching a project this summer that anyone in Oregon can participate in to try and see how these bees have spread after they were first detected in Southern Oregon through the state. And so in this episode, you're going to hear some of the basic biology of these bees, but more importantly, how you can participate and contribute to this project over the course of the summer. Okay, so without further ado, let's head into the squash or zucchini or pumpkin patch with Miranda Jones this week on Pollination. Okay, well, welcome to Pollination, Miranda.
Thank you so much. It's an honor.
Well, the honor's all ours because we're really excited. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that's been top of my mind and a lot of people's mind for the last couple of years, these squash bees. Now, squash bees are a recent resident in Oregon. Can you tell us about the long history of these bees' journey to Oregon and what species, actually is here in Oregon?
Sure thing. The history goes back pretty far. Starting farther back than 10,000 years ago, we had wild cucumber species developing in Mexico and some of the southern United States. These wild species became cultivated by humans around 10,000 years ago, and these wild cultivars.
Yeah. So you just, So you said cucumbers. And then you said cucurbits. So they sound the same, but they're different. Just before we get into this history, so what is this cucurbit?
Yeah, cucurbits are a genus that I have a hard time saying. They compose our winter and summer squashes. So typically like pumpkins and gourds that you see around Halloween, those are winter squashes. And then summer squashes are things like yellow squash and zucchini.
Okay, so wind it back. Before 10,000 years, there were the wild plants that are in the cucurbit family. So not pumpkins, but something that was wild. And there were bees around them. Okay, pick up the story. I'm sorry for throwing you off track.
Yeah, so those are our evolutionary ancestors for the plants we have today. Then humans began cultivating these things because, first of all, they made amazing containers. So originally there were wild cultivars for containing things like water, like acting like water jugs. And the bees followed these wild cultivars. As humans migrated around, they took these plants with them, and the bees hitched along for a ride. Eventually, agriculture really started developing, and we began using these plants for fruit and for cooking and eating. And they started to really spread throughout the entire United States. And of course, with the agriculture we have now, we have squash farms just about everywhere. The squash bee population has spread all the way up to California. And until recently, we hadn't seen a single species in Oregon. But now, since 2016, we have a few official sightings of Peponapis pruinosa.
What a great name. Okay, so
I was thinking we need a pop filter for this interview just because of all the P sounds.
And we're gonna say squash a lot in this episode.
We are, yeah.
Okay, so this bee, and I remember this because it was the Bee Girl organization down in Ashland. They were running a summer camp, and they were in a squash patch and they saw something and it looked kind of like a honeybee, but it was flatter and faster. And then that turned out to be the first discovery. I love it that kids on a trip in a farm found this thing. It's just the best story ever.
Yeah, I love that too. Well, I believe the kid pointed at it and said, "That honeybee is squished." And that was how we discovered squash bees in Oregon.
Yeah, it was just mispronouncing that honeybee is squash. The squash.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this bee. Why are you interested in this bee? What do you find most interesting about squash bees? What is it about this bee that fascinates you?
Well, I think that it interests me from a research perspective, just because of the fact that it was only discovered for the first time 5 years ago. It seems like 2016 was like a minute ago, but 5 years ago was the first discovery. And I think that provides a really unique opportunity to look at sort of the speed at which flying insects can spread with their host plants, especially agricultural host plants and host plants that people put in their gardens. As an insect itself, I think it's really fascinating that the squash bee depends on the squash plant, not only for food like an ordinary monophagous insect might, but it depends on it for shelter, for finding and locating mates. The females even use the pollen to feed their young in their nests. So it's really fascinating to me. This like co-evolutionary history is really deep and the symbiosis is very strong.
I could just imagine.
Super cool.
Well, I could just imagine, like, just the way that you put that. Like, there's these bees that found a squash patch in Ashland, and now they're like sending out their scout. Like, the next generation is like, maybe there's squash over that horizon, and sort of like they're kind of like looking around the landscape, looking for these patches of pumpkin, squash, zucchinis, and they're kind of like, going north. They're heading north.
Absolutely. They're going to go crazy when they find the pumpkin patches.
Well, I guess this is, one of the reasons I want to have you on the show. You're doing this, really great project. And, let's say you're listening to this episode and your zucchinis, we were just out at a farm right now and we saw like some zucchini flowers. So let's say people wanted to spot these bees in their garden. How do they detect them? How can they see these things? Tricks and tips.
So my recommendation, of course, yes. My recommendation as a morning person is to go out at about 10 a.m., maybe a little bit earlier if you live somewhere pretty arid and hot. And you'll want to go out and start looking in squash flowers. The reason you want to go out early is that bees, when they wake up in the morning, they have to spend a while warming up their bodies so that their flight muscles can work. They'll usually be like vibrating in their nests for a little while, just warming up. And it just so happens that squash bees are pretty efficient at doing this. They'll generally get out and start foraging a little earlier than honeybees will. And this is really important because, as we talked about with the discovery of the squash bees, they're easy to mix up between the two. So it's really good if you can provide yourself an opportunity to go to your squash flowers at a time when there won't be honeybees, because that'll tell you that's probably a squash bee right there.
Oh, so if you go early before the honeybees kind of get out, then if a bee is there, that's like a good sign that it is a squash bee. I remember we were talking about this
Absolutely
recently, that, these bees, like, they don't need much light. In fact, they'll start foraging very, very early. And I imagine with a squash plant, they want to get to the buffet first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they depend on the squash. They don't need sunlight. They don't need anything.
Well, now
they're ready to go.
And I always think about anything in that family will then close up. Like the flowers don't stay open all day. So, are you after that point? Is your squash bee hunting done?
Definitely, if you're not a morning person, you don't have to make sure you get to your garden before your squash plant flowers close. You can certainly go out after they've closed. The only negative to that is that you have to open the flowers. It's not very difficult to do. It's quite like opening a banana. Just be gentle. And squash bees will actually use that flower as shelter to sleep in during the hottest parts of the day and the night. So Yeah. So these are the male squash bees. The females have nests off-site, but the males will stay in the squash flowers all night long. So this is a great way to see squash bees again, because honeybees do not do this. They're eusocial. They return to their colonies and their hives. So the only bees you're going to find in a squash flower that's closed that have that similar morphology to honeybees are going to be squash bees.
Oh, that's cool. So so the flowers close, and then I guess the male's just going to hunker down. The female's gone back to her nest somewhere in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so you peel this thing back like a banana, and if you see the bees in there, you hear a little buzz. I guess it goes without saying for our listeners who may not know this, that a male bee doesn't have a stinger. So even if they kind of buzz, you don't have to freak out. We watched a YouTube video the other day of some person who discovered this. They were like, "There's bees in my squash flowers. What's going on?" And they buzz, and he freaked out because he was holding his iPhone and had a squash plant, and it's like he peeled it back and was like, "Ah!" But you don't have to freak out.
Yeah, I think if anyone's freaking out, it'll be the bees in that situation. You really don't have to worry about it yourself. They're just going to fly away if they fly away at all. They're non-aggressive. They're tired and they're confused. So just feel free to open your squash flowers and see what's in there. It's absolutely a treasure trove, I'm sure.
Okay, well, so you're really interested in these bees because of this idea, just tracking a bee that's kind of dispersing through a state, trying to figure out the rate of doing that. So you're doing a project this summer to sort of see where the bees are, because I think we only have we know they're down in southern Oregon, and I think there's been some detections south of Corvallis, but sporadic. How can people, some person listening to this episode, help us build a picture of where these bees are in the state?
Yeah, so if you're an Oregonian and you have any sort of camera and you've seen a squash plant, you can help. Our goal is just to get a lot of photographic data of possible squash bee sightings. So if you have your own garden or your own farm, or you have friends who have squash plants in their gardens, just take a look at some squash flowers and take some photos of whatever you've got inside. If they're honeybees, that's okay. If they're bumblebees, that's fine. But we do want to get some squash bee sightings, and we have a survey that you can link right into and just upload those photos, and we can have professional bee taxonomists look at it and identify your bees.
Okay, that's great. So you go through, and there's also a training video, I think, that's going to be up on this page, which is at, I guess, Oregon Bee Atlas. If you go to OregonBeeAtlas.org, at the top there's a little thing you press called Squash Bee Survey, and in that you'll find the link to how to upload your images, but also a training video that you just finished.
Yes, training video out in the hot sun. It was a very fun time.
Okay, so people are going to do this, and so let's say people are doing this. So they've got these bees. They've gone in the morning and they made their cup of coffee, and they got up early, and they see these bees flying in and out. How do you take a picture of a flying bee? Like, what's the best way to do this?
I would definitely not suggest taking a picture of a flying bee.
Okay.
Wait till they settle down. They will be feeding in these flowers for upwards of a minute sometimes. They'll really be digging in there. There's tons of nectar pooled at the bottom of this large flower, and they will be just sucking it up. So just if you don't see any pollinators stopping in your flowers, just stop at a flower and wait for a minute, see if anything arrives. And if you've got lots of bugs in your flowers, just go and check out what's in there. If there's things that look like bees, take some pictures. There's no need to stress yourself out trying to chase bees around. Looking in the flowers will be perfectly sufficient. There should be plenty of things going on in there.
And I guess in the survey, even if you don't know if it's a squash bee or not, that's totally fine. But I guess you can also, we want you to guess, I suppose, like, do you think it's a squash bee or not? So your level of confidence, I guess you can put in a little survey.
Yeah, absolutely. On the survey, there's one questionnaire where you can sort of rate your confidence of, is this a squash bee or is this not a squash bee? And it's absolutely fine if you just want to take a wild guess and say, yes, I'm pretty sure this is a squash bee. There's tons of pictures online. You can compare your pictures to other people's pictures, but don't worry too much about getting exactly the right bee. We'll be happy to see whatever you have.
And so at the end of the year, will you accept payment of zucchini?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, folks. So grow your zucchinis and keep your eyes on them, and your squash and your pumpkins. And I guess what the burning question is, what happens at the end? So how are people, you kind of participate in this thing, how are you going to know the answer to where the squash bee is? When will people know how things turned out? And if they have squash bees?
Yeah, oh, for sure. I want to let everyone know as soon as possible if we think their squash bee sighting is truly a squash bee. We want to coordinate with people because the best scientific data for this type of thing is a physical specimen that can be identified. So if you have some really good squash bee sightings at your plot of squash, we will probably try and coordinate with you via email to have a master melittologist volunteer to come out and gather some physical specimens to have our taxonomist look at.
Fantastic. Well, this sounds really exciting. And I have my own little zucchini plant it's got, it's starting to come up. So this is timely. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you find out, and maybe we'll have you back on the show in the fall, and you can give us the answer of where the squash bee is. How far it's traveled.
Oh, I'm so excited to see what's going on in Oregon.
Well, thank you so much, Miranda, and good luck with your research.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sin and Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.